Hi, Catechus, the Damned. I saw that you left a reply video for me that didn't have any sound, and you said that you were going to repost it after you figured out what went wrong. And I hope you do, because I'm curious to see it. But meanwhile, I watched your Sheeple video, and it inspired me to do a little musing about the uses of animal metaphors for human nature. Now, in the example that you were talking about, which was this essay by the retired Ranger Colonel called On Sheep, Sheepdogs and Wolves, he makes the analogy that the American people are sheep, the criminals and terrorists who prey on the people are wolves, and the police and military personnel who protect the sheep are sheepdogs. And you make the point that this is probably a metaphor invented by a Christian, since the implied shepherd, who isn't actually mentioned in the metaphor, is Jesus. And I think that's probably correct. It's also, I think, probably a military metaphor. I don't think that the general public would immediately start out thinking of themselves as the sheep. But it's somewhat self-congratulatory about being a sheepdog. You're loyal, you're trustworthy, you're on the side of good. The sheep owe everything to you and don't appreciate you, etc., etc., etc. But it is interesting in that it's interesting for its subtext and its possibly unintended meanings, among them that in this scenario the human race is reduced to animals, and the only actual human implied in it is Jesus. And of course this is kind of ironic for a Christian metaphor, but not if you're just trying to make a point. But the other interesting subtextual point is that the metaphor seems to imply that within the human race there are people who, because they're being compared to these animal species, there are people who cannot help but be sheep, cannot help but be wolves, cannot help but be sheepdogs, because a sheep doesn't turn into a wolf, and even a sheepdog, though it may go wild, doesn't turn into a wolf, and etc., etc. In other words, it's an implied argument for the innateness of human nature, and thus the absence of free choice about these very important distinctions that the analogist is trying to make. And as you point out, it's also an unintended cautionary metaphor for a situation in which the sheepdogs are making a claim for their moral authority and goodness, but if there actually is no shepherd, if there is no God in this Christian metaphor, then you really have to wonder how long the sheepdogs can keep from turning into rivals of the wolves for the eating of sheep. But I'm not really that interested in the Christian significance of this analogy. What caught my imagination was just realizing that we as human beings are constantly comparing other human beings and ourselves sometimes to various animals based on innate characteristics of that species. But we don't, almost no one compares the entire human race to a single species in one of these analogies. It's always certain people are wolves, others are sheep, and then there are the sheepdogs. It's always a case of dividing up the unity of the human race into separate species based on a narrower set of characteristics than humanity as a whole displays. And I don't know, this is another one of my great blogs where I haven't thought it through ahead of time, so I'm not really sure what that says, other than that something about humanity transcends the narrowness of other mammal species in terms of how we can organize ourselves. And this, I mean, this isn't really a surprise. It obviously has to do with our mental capacity, that we can be like herd animals or like pack animals or like lone wolves. And there are even a few people who come off as, snakes and reptiles and, the occasional black widow spider, that we can encompass all of that, but also that as human beings we like to compare ourselves to these narrower animal characteristics. Is it just the ease with which you can characterize someone by comparing them to an animal, or is it is it a sneaking recognition that we are divided up in some way that is not what is the word I'm looking for? That is that we are divided by invisible boundaries that can't be crossed. And I'm not talking about race here, because race is a boundary that can be crossed at any time, and in fact, all the races of the earth are underneath intermingled, and really a race is just a regional variation in the unity of the human race, the human species. But every time we use these analogies, we are implying that underneath race and underneath the unity of the human species, human beings are born and develop into separate groups that do not cross, because a sheep never becomes a wolf. But getting back to the sheep and wolves metaphor, it strikes me that if we're talking about Americans, the herd animal that we should be talking about is not sheep, but cattle. Because cattle are big, dangerous animals, whether or not they want to be. And they can do a tremendous amount of damage, even after being domesticated, especially if they're spooked, and if they stampede. And of course, cattle are not herded by shepherds, but by cowboys. And the cowboys can not only herd the cattle and brand the cattle and count the cattle and send them off to market, or if they're lucky, I guess, to the milk farm. But they can also use the cattle to destroy their enemies, for instance, the dirt farmers, by stampeding the cattle through the dirt farmers' well-tended plots of bleeding heart liberal greenery. And they can also, if they're sloppy and lazy cowboys, get trampled to death by their own cattle. So there's danger there. There's a certain awesomeness to the cowboy that the shepherd just doesn't have. And of course, the other thing is, if we can stretch this metaphor insanely, if the cowboys decide to herd the cattle into voting booths and make them choose a leader, the cattle are going to choose a cowboy, because the cattle are domesticated animals. They depend on cowboys. They can't survive on their own. And I don't think they would recognize anyone who didn't act like a cowboy as their leader. And it's also true that the major threat to cattle is not generally wolves or coyotes, but or at least in the traditional cowboy metaphor of the past, the major threat to cattle is rustlers, who of course are not another kind of animal, but evil cowboys. Cowboys who are not serving the cowboy's master. And of course the cowboy's master is not the shepherd, not Jesus, but the cattle baron, who may once have been a cowboy himself, but who is now off living the good life up at the big house, talking with the rail barons and the and the meat packers, and making the big deals, and the cowboys are basically just human sheepdogs. Do these metaphors mean anything beyond just an easy way of talking? Do they tell us anything about the way different groups of human beings interact with each other, and what can be expected from different groups of human beings? I mean, it's a fact that cattle, and sheep for that matter, are not the natural animals that they were to begin with. They have changed over time, partially by accidental evolution of human beings picking the animals that were the most useful to them, and breeding them, and then more recently in history by conscious breeding by human beings. So obviously cattle are different now than they were once upon a time. So in that sense, cattle can change. And certainly the cowboy isn't what he used to be. And some of that may actually be innate, not necessarily bred within a population of cowboys, but certainly selected for, in terms of what is expected of a cowboy in the world today versus what a cowboy used to be. And then coming back to the whole Christianity aspect that was brought up earlier. I mean, I'm not the first person to suggest that some people just can't be atheists, in the same way that some people just can't believe in a deity. And while I'm assuming you're an atheist or an agnostic as well, while we atheists or agnostics feel that the reason we don't believe in a God is because we're right, that may not be the whole story, because certainly there are some people who can't understand math. There are some people who are geniuses at math but can't understand human emotion.